I always thought of our family as a typical one, but that one night changed my life forever. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to change. Our days were predictable, our routines set in stone. My mom, always busy with work and managing the house, and my dad, the quieter one, more reserved. My relationship with my parents was good, but there was always something about Dad that felt distant. Like there was a part of him I never truly understood. When my mom started traveling more for work, things in the house changed. It wasn't like we didn't get along, my dad and I. But without my mom around to balance everything out, it felt different. The absence of her presence left a strange void, and Dad and I were left to navigate the house together in a way we hadn't before. I was 19, about to start my second year at college, and I was staying home for the summer. Mom had gone away on a work trip for 2 weeks, and it was just Dad and me. I thought it would be easy enough. Quiet dinners, maybe a few days where we wouldn't see much of each other because of our separate routines. But it turned out to be something else entirely. It all started one warm Saturday evening. We had spent most of the day doing our own things. I was hanging out in my room, scrolling through my phone, and Dad was outside working on something in the garage. When dinner time rolled around, he called me downstairs. He had made some pasta, and we sat down to eat together in the quiet kitchen. The evening sun cast a soft golden light through the windows, making everything feel a little too perfect, almost surreal. "How's everything going?" he asked, breaking the silence as he twirled some pasta on his fork. "Good," I replied, though there wasn't much to say. "Same as always." He nodded, and we ate in silence for a few more moments. I could feel his eyes on me now and then, like he was about to say something but was holding back. It wasn't unusual. Dad wasn't much of a talker. But that evening, something felt different. "You know," he said, setting his fork down and leaning back in his chair, "it's nice having you around more. We don't get to talk as much these days." I glanced up at him, surprised. He was right, of course. As I'd gotten older and more focused on school and my friends, I hadn't really spent much time with my dad. Not like when I was a kid, when we would work on projects together or go fishing on weekends. "Yeah, I guess," I said with a small smile. "Things just got busy, college and everything." He smiled back, but there was something behind his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "I get it," he said softly. "But it's important to stay connected, especially now that your mom's traveling more." There it was again, that feeling, like there was more to what he was saying than just the words. But I didn't think too much of it at the time. We finished dinner, and I started to clear the plates. "I'll take care of it," Dad said, standing up. "Why don't we watch a movie or something? We haven't done that in a while." "Sure," I agreed, though it felt a little strange. We hadn't really spent much time together lately, and I wasn't sure what had prompted this sudden effort. Still, I wasn't going to argue. We settled into the living room, the TV flickering as Dad flipped through the channels, eventually landing on some old action movie. I wasn't paying much attention, my thoughts drifting. Dad was sitting close to me on the couch, closer than usual, but I didn't think much of it at first. As the movie went on, I noticed that his arm was resting on the back of the couch just behind me. I shifted slightly, feeling a little awkward but telling myself it was nothing. It was just Dad after all. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the room began to change. There was an unspoken tension building, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Every time I glanced over at Dad, I found his eyes already on me, watching me in a way that made my heart race for reasons I didn't fully understand. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overthinking it. But then his hand moved. It was subtle at first, just brushing against my shoulder as if by accident. But it lingered a little too long, his fingers lightly grazing my skin. My breath caught in my throat and I shifted uncomfortably, but I still didn't say anything. A few more minutes passed and I could feel the tension growing, thickening the air between us. I tried to focus on the movie, but I couldn't. My thoughts were racing, and I couldn't ignore the feeling of his hand resting on my shoulder, his thumb slowly, almost absent-mindedly, rubbing small circles against my skin. "Dad?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move at first, but then he leaned in slightly, his breath warm against my ear. "What is it?" I froze, my heart pounding. There was something in his voice, something soft but heavy. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to figure out if I was reading too much into this or if something was actually happening. I started, but the words wouldn't come out. Dad's hand slid down my arm slowly, his touch warm and deliberate. My skin tingled where his fingers brushed against it, and I couldn't stop the shiver that ran down my spine. I wanted to pull away, to say something, but I was frozen in place. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the TV. "We're just spending time together, that's all." But it didn't feel like that, not anymore. I stood up suddenly, my heart racing. I think I'm going to head to bed," I said quickly, my voice shaking. Dad looked up at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he was going to say something, but he just nodded, his eyes following me as I backed out of the room. "Good night," he said softly as I hurried up the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it was all in my head. But the memory of his touch lingered, making my skin crawl in a way I couldn't shake. Something had changed between us that night, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to face him the next day, how to pretend that everything was normal when it was anything but. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning after that strange, tense night was filled with silence. I stayed in my room longer than usual, hoping to avoid an awkward breakfast with Dad. But eventually, the hunger gnawed at me, and I knew I couldn't hide away forever. I took a deep breath and made my way downstairs. The kitchen was bathed in sunlight, but despite the brightness, the air felt thick with the memory of the previous evening. I expected to see Dad sitting at the table like he usually did, sipping his coffee and reading the news, but the room was empty. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe he had gone out for the day and I wouldn't have to face him. But just as I poured myself a bowl of cereal, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. My stomach dropped as Dad walked into the kitchen, freshly showered and dressed, looking as though nothing was out of the ordinary. "Morning," he said, giving me a small smile, the same warm, calm expression he always wore. "Morning," I replied, my voice tight, my eyes glued to my cereal as I quickly sat down at the table. I didn't want to make eye contact, didn't want to relive the confusion from the night before. Dad poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. I could feel him watching me, but I kept my head down, hoping he wouldn't say anything. But of course, that wasn't how this was going to go. "You seemed a little tense last night," Dad said, his voice casual. But there was an edge to it that I couldn't ignore. I swallowed hard, my spoon hovering over my bowl. "Yeah, I was just tired. It was nothing." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving my face. The silence stretched between us, and I felt the tension building again, just like it had the night before. "We don't have to make this awkward, you know," Dad said suddenly, setting his mug down and leaning forward slightly. "We're family. We should be able to talk about anything." I looked up at him then, my heart racing. The way he said it, the way his voice softened, it wasn't a suggestion. It was almost a challenge. "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the nerves were creeping in. "But it's not... nothing really happened, right?" Dad leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. "That's up to you," he said quietly. "If you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to." But if something's on your mind, you can always tell me." I stared at him, my thoughts racing. Did he know what he was doing? Was he testing me, seeing how far he could push this unspoken boundary between us? Or was I the one reading too much into things? I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad's expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand gently brushing against mine. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to. I just want you to feel comfortable with me." The touch of his hand sent a jolt through me, and I quickly pulled mine away, standing up from the table. "I'm going to head out for a bit," I said, grabbing my phone from the counter. "I need some air." Dad didn't stop me. He just nodded, watching me as I hurried out the door, the tension still thick in the air. As soon as I stepped outside, the cool breeze hit my face, and I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My thoughts were a mess, my emotions all over the place. Part of me wanted to believe that I was just overreacting, that this was all in my head, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was happening, and I didn't know how to handle it. I walked for a while, aimlessly wandering through the quiet streets of our neighborhood. I needed to clear my head to figure out how to deal with the strange new dynamic between Dad and me. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of his touch, his words, lingered. By the time I got back home, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the house. I hesitated for a moment before going inside, not sure if I was ready to face Dad again. But I couldn't avoid him forever. When I walked into the house, the first thing I noticed was the sound of the TV in the living room. Dad was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels just like the night before. He glanced up when he saw me, giving me a small smile. "Feel better?" he asked, his tone casual. But there was something in his eyes that made my heart race all over again. "Yeah," I lied, walking past the living room and heading toward the stairs. "Just needed to clear my head." "Good," he said, his eyes following me as I made my way up the stairs. "Let me know if you want to talk later." I didn't respond. I just hurried up to my room, shutting the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with a mix of emotions I didn't know how to handle. That night, I stayed in my room, avoiding Dad as much as I could. I could hear him moving around downstairs, the sounds of him watching TV and eventually heading to bed. But I didn't leave my room. I couldn't. The next few days passed in much the same way. I kept my distance, avoiding long conversations and trying to keep everything as normal as possible. But every time I saw Dad, I could feel the tension between us growing, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a weight we were both carrying. And then, one evening, it all came to a head. It was a Friday night, and Mom was still away on her trip. I had been in my room all day, trying to distract myself with TV and scrolling through my phone, but the tension in the house was getting to me. I decided to go downstairs for some fresh air, hoping it would help me clear my mind. When I walked into the living room, Dad was there, sitting on the couch with a beer in his hand. He looked up when he saw me, and I could tell immediately that something was different. There was a look in his eyes, something darker, something I hadn't seen before. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Come sit with me for a bit." I hesitated, my heart pounding. There was something in his voice, in the way he was looking at me, that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm good," I said quickly, turning toward the door. "Just needed some air." But before I could leave, Dad stood up, moving toward me with a quiet, deliberate step. My heart raced and I backed up instinctively, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't stop. He just kept walking toward me, his eyes locked on mine, the room suddenly feeling too small, too close. And then he was standing right in front of me, his hand reaching out to touch my arm, his fingers warm against my skin. "You don't have to be scared," he whispered, his voice soft but firm. "It's just us. There's no one else here." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just in my head. This was real, and there was no turning back. I stood there frozen, my back against the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room felt too quiet, the air too thick. Dad's hand was still resting on my arm, his fingers pressing just a little too hard, lingering longer than they should have. His touch sent a wave of confusion and fear rushing through me, making my stomach churn. "You don't have to be scared," Dad repeated, his voice even softer this time, like he was trying to soothe me. But the way he said it only made the tension worse, made the panic in my chest flare up even more. "I'm not," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. But we both knew that wasn't true. Dad's eyes stayed on mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, and I didn't know if I was going to fall or be pulled back to safety. "You don't have to pretend," he said, his fingers sliding down my arm in a way that made my skin tingle. "I know what you're feeling." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine, and I pulled my arm away, taking a step back. My heart was racing, and my mind was spinning with 1,000 different thoughts, none of them making any sense. I started, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what was happening when I didn't even understand it myself? Dad took another step toward me, closing the distance between us again, and this time, I couldn't move. His hand reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair away from my face, his fingers grazing my cheek. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his voice low, almost too quiet to hear. "Just let it happen." I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, like everything was moving too fast and too slow at the same time. My legs were frozen, my body refusing to move, even though every part of me was screaming to get out of the room, to run, to do anything but stand there and let this happen. "Dad, please," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "This isn't right." His hand dropped to his side, but he didn't move back. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, something I didn't recognize. "I know it feels confusing," he said softly, "but it's not wrong. You'll understand that soon." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in around me, trapping me in this moment with no way out. "I'm your father," he continued, his voice calm, soothing. "I've always been here for you, and I always will be." The words felt like they were twisting in my stomach, making me feel sick. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out, to put some distance between us, to think. I couldn't stay in this room with him, not when everything was spinning out of control. "I need some air," I said, backing up toward the door. I need to go." Dad didn't try to stop me this time. He just stood there, watching me with that same unreadable expression, his eyes following my every move. I turned and left, my breath shaky as I hurried down the hallway, my mind racing. When I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I sucked in a deep breath, trying to calm myself. But it didn't help. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing with fear and confusion. What had just happened? What was going on with Dad? I couldn't wrap my head around it. Part of me wanted to believe that I had misunderstood, that I was overreacting. But the way he had looked at me, the way he had touched me, it wasn't my imagination. I knew that now. I walked for what felt like hours, my thoughts tangled, my emotions a mess. I didn't know where to go or who to talk to. I couldn't tell anyone about this. Who would believe me? And what would it even mean if they did? It wasn't like Dad had done anything, yet. But I knew that was a lie. He had done something. He had crossed a line, and even though it wasn't physical, it felt like the ground beneath me had shifted in a way that I couldn't ignore. The worst part was, I didn't know how to stop it from happening again. By the time I got back home, the house was quiet. I hesitated at the front door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure if I was ready to go back inside. But where else could I go? This was my home, and there was nowhere else to run. When I finally walked inside, the lights were off, and I heard nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator. The living room was empty. I breathed a small sigh of relief. Maybe Dad had gone to bed, and I wouldn't have to face him tonight. But as I made my way up the stairs, my stomach knotted with anxiety. The house felt different now, and no matter how much I wanted to go back to the way things were before, I knew I couldn't. Everything had changed. When I got to my room, I shut the door softly behind me, locking it for good measure. I leaned against it, my head spinning. I didn't know what to do next. The night had taken a turn I never saw coming, and I didn't know how to process it. I lay down on my bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I could just go to sleep and forget about what had happened. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. There was more to come. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to handle it. The next morning, I woke up feeling heavy, like there was a weight pressing down on my chest that I couldn't shake. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind like a dark cloud, and I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to confront what was happening between Dad and me, even if it terrified me. I stayed in my room for as long as I could, trying to gather my thoughts, but the tension in the house was suffocating. Eventually, I knew I had to face it. I couldn't stay hidden forever. My body felt tense with dread as I made my way downstairs, each step feeling like it was pulling me deeper into something I didn't want to face. The kitchen was empty when I got there, but I could hear the faint sound of the TV coming from the living room. Dad was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen, but I knew he had been waiting for me. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and I could feel my heart racing as I approached him. "Morning," he said, without looking at me, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it that I couldn't ignore. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely audible. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong, but I didn't know how to start this conversation. How was I supposed to talk to my father about something like this? Finally, I took a deep breath and sat down across from him. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Dad looked at me then, his eyes serious, but there was a flicker of something else. Something darker. Something that made my stomach twist with anxiety. "What about?" "You know what," I said quietly. "Last night, what happened?" For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, leaning back on the couch and rubbing his hand over his face. "Look," he said, his voice low, "I think you're making this into something bigger than it is." I felt a wave of anger and confusion wash over me. "I'm not making it up," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You touched me, Dad. You said things." His jaw tightened and he looked away, his eyes focusing on the TV as if that would somehow make the conversation go away. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. "You're just growing up. I wanted to make sure you knew that I was here for you." I stared at him, my heart pounding. That's not what it felt like. For the first time, I saw something break in his calm exterior. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw guilt flash across his face. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "You're confused," he said, his voice firmer now. "I'm your father. I would never hurt you." I felt my hands trembling in my lap, a mix of fear and frustration bubbling up inside me. "It's not about hurting me," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about crossing a line." There it was, the truth out in the open. The words hung between us, heavy and raw. I couldn't take them back, and I didn't want to. I had to stand my ground, even though it felt like my world was crumbling around me. Dad stood up, pacing the room with an uneasy energy. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "We're family. You're reading too much into this." But I knew I wasn't. I knew that what had happened wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it had changed everything. "I'm not a kid anymore," I said, my voice steadying. "I know what's going on." Dad stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto mine. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and I could see the battle going on inside him. The silence stretched on, and I could feel my pulse in my ears, the tension in the room nearly suffocating. Finally, he let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping as if he had finally given up trying to pretend. "I didn't want this to happen," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "Then why did it?" He sat back down on the couch, his hands rubbing together nervously. "I don't know," he said, his voice sounding small, defeated. I guess I was lonely. Your mom's been gone so much and you've grown up so fast. I don't know, it got out of control." The confession hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was the truth. And now that it was out, there was no going back. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice breaking. "I've messed everything up." I sat there, staring at him, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside me: anger, sadness, fear, and confusion. I didn't know what to say. How could I? There was no easy way to fix what had happened between us. No simple words that could make it all go away. "We need help," I said finally, my voice shaking. "We can't just ignore this." Dad nodded slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "I know," he whispered. "I'll figure something out. I'll make this right." But I wasn't sure if he could. I wasn't sure if anyone could. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable silence. Dad and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was only about practical things, when Mom would be back, what groceries we needed, things that felt meaningless compared to the weight of what we were both carrying. It wasn't until Mom returned from her trip that things finally came to a head. She walked in, her suitcase in hand, smiling as she greeted us, oblivious to the tension that had settled into our house like a thick fog. I felt a surge of guilt, knowing what had happened while she was gone, and knowing that I couldn't keep it a secret forever. That night, after dinner, I sat down with her, my heart racing as I told her everything. I told her about the tension, about what Dad had done, about how it had made me feel. She listened, her face growing paler with every word, and by the time I finished, she was sitting in stunned silence. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I don't know how to fix this." Mom didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, staring into the distance, her face tight with anger and hurt. Then, finally, she stood up, her movements sharp and deliberate. "I'll handle it," she said quietly, her voice cold. "This isn't your fault." And she did handle it. The next few weeks were a blur of difficult conversations, of therapists and counselors, of trying to piece together the fragments of our broken family. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I had ever been through. But slowly, things started to shift. Slowly, we began to heal. Dad moved out for a while, giving us space, and in that time, I focused on myself, on finding my own strength, on understanding the complicated feelings I had been carrying. I didn't know if I would ever fully forgive him, or if things would ever go back to the way they were before. But I knew that I couldn't let this define me, and in time, I found a way to move forward. Luckily, I did.